Good morning or good evening, depending on where you are watching us from. Welcome to Asia Undercurrent. I'm Jeffrey Hornung. Today, we are going to talk about Japan's new security strategy. How can we achieve stability in the Indo-Pacific region and beyond? But before I get started, let me get some administrative notes out of the way. We will be welcoming questions later on in our discussion today, and I would like to ask those of you who are interested in asking a question to our panelists to please scroll down the page and look for the Q&A button. And when you do ask the question later, please make sure to add your name and affiliation so our speakers know who's asking the question. Okay, with that, let's get started. In December of last year, the Kishida administration released Japan's so-called three key security documents: the National Security Strategy, the National Defense Strategy, and the Defense Build-Up Program, describing Japan's security environment as the most severe and complex since the end of World War II. These documents lay the foundation for what could be a historic transformation in Japan. Now, as many of you know, these documents collectively represent path-breaking change and signals that Tokyo is committed to do far more for its defense and international security than any time before. This includes a dramatic increase in annual defense spending by almost 60% in the next 5 years, and the acquisition of many advanced defense capabilities that would position Japan to be a critical force multiplier in the region. The totality of Japan's new strategic vision reflects a significant evolution to its approach to defense and deterrence. Now, of course, these changes did not come out of nowhere, as years of provocations by Japan's neighbors have resulted in Tokyo no longer willing to tolerate attempts to change the status quo by force or threaten the rule of law in the Indo-Pacific region and beyond. These efforts are also not unilateral, as Japan looks to further strengthen strategic relations with like-minded allies worldwide, while maintaining its alliance with the United States as the foundation upon which to move forward. Today, we're gathered to examine what will these changes mean for Japanese foreign policy, its defense posture, and its security activities in foreign relations in the Indo-Pacific and around the world. We are also going to explore potential challenges that could disrupt or change the implementation of these strategies in the years ahead. Now, for that, we have assembled an absolute superstar cast of speakers who are going to answer all our questions about these new documents and make us smarter in the next hour and 15 minutes. I'm honored to be your moderator and introduce our three speakers, who I will introduce in the order that they will present, and then turn over to them for some opening remarks. And I will just provide brief introductory titles for our speakers. And if you want to learn more about their research interests and backgrounds, I would ask you to please look at their full bios at the Asia Undercurrent website. Our first speaker will be Dr. Ken Jimbo, who's the president of the Asia-Pacific Initiative and a professor at the Faculty of Policy Management at Keio University. Our next speaker is Dr. Jennifer Lind, associate professor of government at Dartmouth and a faculty associate at the Reischauer Institute for Japanese Studies at Harvard University. She is also a research associate in the Asia program and the program on the US and the Americas at Chatham House in London. And finally, Dr. Chisako Masuo, who's professor at the Faculty of Social and Cultural Studies at Kyushu University, and also an adjunct fellow at the Japan Institute of International Affairs. With that, I'll turn it over to Ken. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Jeffrey. And as you laid out already, the three documents are certainly the historical benchmark of Japan's national strategy. And I would say they have almost equal weight in the significance in the past conclusion of the US-Japan Security Treaty in 1951, the revision of the treaty in 1960, and the decision by the former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe on the security legislation in 2015 that allowed Japan to exercise collective self-defense. And by the way, this milestone of the history is precisely what the Prime Minister Kishida mentioned in his speech at the Johns Hopkins University on January 13th. And as Jeff mentioned, there were two major decisions that should be highlighted, and I think it's worth highlighting. Number one is the increase of the defense spending, double the size to 2% of the GDP at the current level by 2027. And the second is the fundamental reinforcement of the defense capability. And most symbolically, this involves the procurement of the long-range counter-strike capability. So I'd like to address why we reached that decision and what we aim to achieve through those decisions and whether we are doing enough. First, there has been an increased awareness among the Japanese of how severe the security environment surrounding our country. In the document, we call China the greatest security challenge, and North Korea as a grave and imminent threat, and Russia as a strong security concern. And all are nuclear weapon states, by the way, and though they are no formal mechanism among us to assure the maintenance of status quo. In terms of Russia, Japan once tried to detach Russia from these equations in the previous strategy in 2013 by pursuing a peace treaty negotiation with them and offering the economic cooperation package, but with the aim that the Russian economic interests can be diversified in Asia and not always be entangled together with China. So it was a wedge strategy that aimed to alter the Chinese and Russian interests in the 2013 documents. But I think that approach was literally gone on February 24th last year with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So this tells how significant the Ukraine crisis that became the wake-up call for both Germany and Japan on reorienting their defense policies. And second, there are increasing attention has been paid to the Taiwan crisis. So if China ever invades Taiwan, and that leads to potentially a severe escalation to our major war. And that is far beyond what Japan prepared till 2010s, where we're still discussing the small-scale contingency or gray zone challenges seem to be the major scenario at that time. So we must definitely prepare for the high-end type of scenario that requires the robust defense capability. Now, laying out three quick points. Number one, I think what we have adopted in the three document is what we can call the strategy of denial. And we are not trying to match up the Chinese capability by building our forces proportionally because China, spends more than 5 times, more defense budget than us, and even our 2% of the GDP will not suffice the material balance of power vis-a-vis China. And rather, we are aiming for denying Chinese prospect of operational success in major scenarios. So this is where the concept of the denial comes in. And even if our material power is consistently inferior to them, we may be able to weigh the high cost of for the Chinese, trying to change the status quo by force. So the Japanese long-range strike capability, anti-ship missiles and surface-to-surface missiles will play major roles in complicating Chinese strategic calculus for their attempt to change the status quo. But what if the denial strategy fails? And I think if the invasion happens, and I think Japan has got to achieve the next scenario, which is to achieve the asymmetrical advantage vis-a-vis adversaries through so-called cross-domain operations that involve space, cyber, and electromagnetic warfare and the unmanned system. You can name it a few. So if we try to fight like a one-by-one on the equal basis, like a sumo wrestling game, we're gonna fail. But if we are capable enough to bring in the different rules of the game through the cross-domain operations, we may have a multi-domain advantage. So finally, are we good enough? And my tentative answer is we are good, but not enough. And I think we're good because we try to demonstrate our resolve in the defense reinforcement, which is also good for the alliance, but not enough in order to achieve the practical measures for denial strategy and still under finance for investing towards the future warfare, which is an essential platform for maintaining the technological advantage for the future. So I'll stop here and look forward to the further discussion.
Thank you, Ken. Next, Jenny, over to you.
Thank you so much. And just let me say again, I'm thrilled to be here and on this amazing panel and talking about just one of the most important foreign policy developments, I think, in the world these days. So we've been talking about already these big changes in Japanese national security policy. There's a couple of reactions to this that you see in the news. So there's the fringe reaction, as I would describe it, which would include the Chinese reaction, which says, when you look at all these changes, it tells us Japan is remilitarizing. And I think this is clearly wrong. It's kind of offensive. Japan is clearly not a country with a military posture that's aimed at aggression in the region. And so, again, we can dismiss this reaction. Another reaction is that this is both a huge change in Japan's national security policy, but it's part of the emergence of a regional balancing coalition to manage China's rise. And I have to say that initially this was my reaction. Again, I was so struck by what historic change this is, as Ken and Jeff have already mentioned. This is such a big shift for Japan, and it's coming on top of a lot of regional trends that we've been observing. And let me say, I hope this is the case, but I think it is too soon to conclude this. And I wanted to raise a couple points to question whether we're actually seeing meaningful balancing against China's rise. My first point is that there's a big difference between what a country says it will appropriate for defense versus what it will actually spend. If you look at America's NATO allies, we routinely see a pattern in which they're appropriating 2%, 1.8%, or so on, which would be more in line with their NATO obligations. But then at the end of the day, they actually spend, 1.4%, 1.3%, and so on. So this news that Japan is saying is doubling its defense spending and will appropriate 2% is, of course, remarkable. But the question is, what will Tokyo actually spend, particularly given all of the public policy challenges that Japanese people are very concerned about? So the actual spending is something to pay attention to as time goes by. My second point is, what is the money actually going to get spent on? So Tokyo may indeed spend it, but the question is whether it will be used to increase Japan's actual military capabilities. So that would include, for example, ammunition, spare parts that get used up in high quality training exercises, air defense capabilities, strike capabilities like Tomahawk and other cruise missiles, hardened aircraft shelters, and so on. But the question is, the money could also be used for other things, salaries, veterans benefits, as an economic boon for base towns, for redistribution through construction projects on bases such to improve barracks. Now, of course, making better barracks is good for Japanese soldiers, but doesn't constitute the kind of purchase of real military capability against China. So what Japan actually spends the money on is yet another factor to watch. My third point is that perhaps we're not getting the right headline for the region. Maybe we're hoping to see a balancing coalition form, but not actually seeing one, at least not yet. The narrative right now is that China or Xi Jinping erred in abandoning the more dovish approach pursued by Deng Xiaoping, that Xi's more hawkish policies have provoked a balancing coalition. And I have to say that this narrative really resonates with my view of the world and my preferences. My approval of Deng Xiaoping's more restrained approach, my worry about Xi's greater foreign policy ambition, my desire to see countries in the region behaving more assertively when it comes to managing China's rise. But taking a step back, is this actually true? And we would need to ask, what would we expect to see if this were true? So let's look at East Asia's defense spending. In Japan, it's, of course, as we said, very big news that Tokyo is doubling its defense spending. But that just brings it to 2% of GDP, which is still a pretty low number that's indeed below the global average. For Taiwan, all we hear about these days is how terrified Taiwan is, especially in the wake of the Ukraine invasion. Taiwan only spends 2.4% of GDP on defense, suggesting it's really not all that terrified. South Korea only spends 2.8%, and it's showing no signs of joining a balancing coalition against China. It's very much hedging. And of course, its security priority remains North Korea. The Philippines also, this is an era in which China's confronting the Philippines over territories, it's grabbing resources from disputed waters and so on. The Philippines spends 1%. To be sure, we could point to different pieces of evidence that a country is trying harder. For example, Japan's recent news was such a monumental change. Japan's improving its security ties with the British and others. Australia is buying nuclear submarines. South Korea and Japan are having a thaw in their relations and are holding naval exercises with the United States. But the bottom line is that East Asian countries are not behaving like countries behave when they're terrified. Israel, for example, spends 5.6%. That's what a country with high threat perception looks like. So of course, it's possible that Japan will actually spend 2%, will actually spend it on real capabilities, and may later increase its spending. But at this point, I would argue that both for Japan and the region more broadly, announcements about a counter-China balancing coalition are premature. We may see it emerge, but so far it hasn't yet. The implications of this is that when it comes to perception of a China threat and a move toward what we'll just have to kind of call it these days, a containment policy, the US remains far out in front of its allies, that its perceptions are not widely shared, and that the US will continue to face problems in putting together a balancing coalition and a technology control regime. The implications are also that if China does have plans for more assertive regional policies, it's probably more likely to get away with them than people currently believe. Because so far, even a notable shift in a more hawkish direction has not produced substantial balancing efforts. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Jenny. That was very thought-provoking. I'll turn next to our final speaker, Chisako. It's over to you.
Yep, thank you, Jeffrey, for your kind introduction, and I thank the government of Japan and Nikkei for allowing me to talk to wonderful audiences for listening today. Well, I am a China expert, so I suppose I am expected to talk on Japan's new national security strategy with regards to China. I regard it as a historical document that laid the foundation for Japan to prepare for increasing uncertainties. But I don't think I need to echo what other speakers have mentioned. So, just to explain the background, I think I have prepared slides here. So. Well, although those changes, the changes under the new security strategy cost 2% of our GDP, which is a double from the current level. 55% of the Japanese supports the decision, according to the Nikkei's research in December. So I think this slide shows why. So, here's a simple comparison of defense budgets of 4 major spenders in Asia. The red line indicates China. You see how remarkable its increase was in last 25 years. Theoretically, I think it is rather surprising how little Japan has responded to it, while India and South Korea have been accumulating their defense budget. Of course, it was partly because of our economic recessions, but it was also because Japan wanted peace and didn't want to cause arms race in this region. But as we have seen in last year, in many decades, China's behaviors changed as its power grew. You see, China only claimed Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands in 1970 first. But in 1992, enacted a new domestic law to claim it. And then its scientific vessels started to hang around in East China Sea in 90s, and oil rigs came. And then in 2008, it started to enter, the patrolling vessels started to enter around the territorial sea of the Senkaku Islands. And 80s, in 2013, aircraft carriers and the military exercises surrounding Taiwan with 5 missiles shot into the Japanese EEZ last summer. And recently, Chinese Coast Guard's activities around Senkaku Islands have been very have been very aggressive, unfortunately. And last December, a new vessel with 76 millimeter cannon intruded into the territorial water near the Senkaku Islands. And nowadays, when Japanese fishing vessels come into the surrounding area, every time the Chinese Coast Guard chase those vessels in the territorial sea. So the situations are very severe. But having said that, as a China expert, those were the changes that caused Japan's new security shift to double its defense spending. However, having said that, as a China expert, I'm a bit skeptical about the idea that we are destined for clash. For Chinese leaders to decide the military operations, these conditions have to be met. They have to have enough capability, and they have to think about the cost that the operations might cost. And then, it has to have the political will, so the domestic, the calculations on the domestic politics needs to be, made. And it's not easy to fulfill those 3 conditions. Some experts argue that the action is coming before 2027, but I don't see any clear evidences in China that it can fulfill them that soon. I don't have time to read them, but those evidences show that they are more. They have to think repeatedly about the decision, and they cannot move that fast. So, recently I see Chinese leaders are also very concerned about their worsening security situations. Well, of course, it's largely due to themselves. But I think there is also a chance for us to try to manage the security dilemma that might be happening in this region. So, last but not least, I want to make some remarks on the security strategy document, which is the core of the 3 key documents. It marked an important start, but not enough in my eyes. Yes, its priority is in defense. There are some assignments left on that side as well. Well, collaboration between the self-defense force and Japan Coast Guard in contingency is not that detailed yet. We have to do more on this side. And also, how do we actually prepare for the clash over Taiwan? We have to, think more thoroughly on this matter too. But in my opinion, the document's weakness lays in diplomatic side, which shall be an important component of our security strategy. I find a bit uneasy that the document identified Japan as one of advanced democratic countries, which might be true, but traditionally on the diplomatic side, Japan always emphasized Asianness of its, in its diplomacy, and the document, and it didn't emphasize Indo-Pacific, this concept either. The emphasis was more on the advanced diplomatic country, and that made me a little uneasy about it. And the document looked quite Western oriented in that sense, and failed to mention how we actually negotiate and collaborate with the global South to re-establish the international order, which is in the question of everyone nowadays. But of course, this new international order needs to be represented by those countries as well, and that applies to China, North Korea, and Russia as well. But that's something too clear. So I am confident that the staff in the Japanese government is clever enough to tackle with those challenges at the next step, and I expect more active diplomacy would come from Tokyo this year. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. Now, the three speakers have provided a lot of different perspectives on the strategies, and so there's a lot to unpack here in the limited time we have. But I want to start by asking a question from a broad regional perspective, and I'm going to direct this to Chisako and Jenny first. We hear a lot, and Ken mentioned it in his remarks, about the motivation behind revising these documents in terms of having these regional countries unilaterally seeking to change the status quo, increases in Chinese defense spending. But motivations aside, what I've been surprised at is the overarching regional support for Japan's documents. And even in the case of South Korea, an acknowledgement by President Yoon that he understands why Japan did what they did. The only criticism that we've heard has really been from China. And so the question I have to you, this is to start off the discussion, is, are you surprised by how these documents have been received, and what accounts for the general positive reactions that we've seen in the region regarding these documents?
Who shall go first?
Well, we could turn it over to you first, Chisako, and then have Jenny give her comments.
Okay, I think overall, many countries in this region also understood that the balance is in change, and it's been and I think it's largely due to the domestic politics. But during the COVID-19, China did make a lot of wrong decision makings. So it held this wolf warrior diplomacy, which scared a lot of people, and that probably made many countries more concerned about China. So probably that explains why. But I want to add a little bit about China's reaction. Overall, I think it's much. Well, of course, China criticized Japan, but the degree was very moderate. Comparing to what we have seen before. So I think, and so that's why I highlighted that there is a chance for us to negotiate with China under this very severe situations, because I see that Chinese leadership is also hoping to see some kind of collaboration with us to manage the security situations in the region, because it's worsening too much. So.
It's a really great question, and I've been intrigued also by reactions. I guess I have a few points I'd make. Number one, I was also intrigued that it was so quietly received in the United States, where, I don't know, maybe I'm just showing my bias, and I'm always so interested in anything that happens with Japanese security. So it's like, can't you believe this? And I was expecting more news and more coverage and just more discussion in general. And there was very little. And there, again, it was quite approving, and Japan is cooperating within the alliance, and this is great news. But it was very mild. My second point is that I think I totally agree with Chisako-san, which is countries are very concerned about China's recent behavior, and military buildup, as she showed on this chart of China's defense spending. So given that context, what Japan is doing is actually quite restrained, right? And so nobody's trying to match that red line. And that was kind of the point that I was making earlier. So that is a really important context for understanding the regional reaction. And one other point I would make is, I think when it comes to Japan's standing in the region, there's the very familiar argument about Japan's history problems and memories of World War II. And this is something I worked on a lot. And I think people don't unpack that enough. And if you do unpack it, what you see is Japan doesn't have history problems. It has a China problem and a South Korea problem. And other countries in the region have been very eager to see a wider, broader regional role by Japan. And other countries Japan has excellent security relations with. And so again, these are the countries that are responding quite favorably. And then just one final point is that during the Cold War, there were times when Japan increased its military capabilities and its roles. And this was in response, again, to declining threat, to increased threat perception when the Soviets were building up in Asia, for example, in the early 80s. And South Korea was quite happy to see that because, again, it saw that regional context. And so South Korea made statements like you're seeing, not quite as much, but you're seeing some, again, expressing, certainly not expressing alarm, certainly not criticizing, but actually welcoming greater Japanese contributions to the region.
Thank you. It's always important to put these things in the historical context for especially for people who don't follow the issues as closely as you do. Let me turn next along, sort of in a similar discussion, but I want to direct my next question to Ken. As Jenny mentioned, there's been a massive amount. There's been a lot of the commentary that is out there is generally positive. And the media articles, analysts have been applauding Japan's documents. But occasionally, as Jenny mentioned, occasionally you'll come across articles warning about the gutting of Japan's constitution or warning that this portends some return of Japanese militarism. While, like Jenny, I believe we can dismiss such articles, given that there's plenty of support, the continuity of past defense concepts and strict adherence to constitutional parameters. I am curious on hearing your thoughts about these things. In particular, how are the changes, especially like counterstrike, how are these changes in alignment with Japan's constitutional interpretations? And also, what do Japan's new strategies mean for regional countries? Is Japan going to be more active in the region, and if so, how?
Well, thanks for that question. I've been wondering how, why the Constitution is so resilient, and it has been there for 70-something years already. And it has been going through with dynamic changes. As I described, there are a couple of historical benchmarks that the national security strategy has been somewhat transformed, but the Constitution remains to be the same. And that is the nature how we try to maintain our basic policy. For example, exclusively defense-oriented defense, and how kind of modest we are in dealing with that situation in the minimum necessary means. And that kind of policy are still existing in our so-called robust defense strategy. And how we can really interpret those kind of two aspects is something can be traced back from how we are responding relatively to the dynamic change of the status, the balance of power. The China spending, as Chisako-san has mentioned, that back in 2005, the Chinese defense budget and Japanese defense budget are almost like equalized. But in past less than 20 years, they are spending 5 times more, and if we remain to be 1%, that's going to be like a 9 to 10 times bigger than us. So this is the scale of the change that we are experiencing, and we are not able to match up by scaling up our defense policy in a proportional terms. So in terms of dealing with that kind of relative change of the balance, I think our kind of the defense buildup can be in line with what we have done in the past. So we adopted some significantly remarkable equipments like counter-strike capability. We are aiming for something like 1,500 kilometers, which is exactly the range you can find from the Kyushu to Taiwan Strait, and that is the 1,500 kilometers. It has lots of implication to appeal to the strategic calculus of the Chinese PLA. But in terms of having that kind of the strategic depth, but that is still remain to be in line with how we try to defend ourselves. In addition to how we can really collaborate on the alliance function, how allowing United States to fight inside the theater, which is also a very challenging task for the U.S. military, and also for what does it mean for the region? And I think region needs the kind of stabilization formula, and that has to be based upon the sound basis of the alliance that could play the platform for the deterrence and response. And if the region is comfortable with that kind of accommodative agenda for the stabilization, that will be the baseline for maintaining the business as usual, which is to have a robust business relationship, although we are having economic security of supply chain resilience measures and all things. But in 2021, we had a remarkable pickup of the trade volumes between Japan and China, and the US and China altogether. So I think that there's a parallel story going on where that there has been a severe security competition going on vis-a-vis China, but at the same time there is a momentum for the aspiration for maintaining the business as usual.
Thank you. Let me turn next to deep dive on 2 separate pillars of the documents. And this first question I'm going to direct to all of you just to get your thought. The first one I want to deep dive on is more of the defense side of the strategies that came out. We see 7 broad areas of focus for the defense buildup. This consists of standoff capabilities, integrated air and missile defense, uncrewed systems, cross-domain capabilities, mobility and lift, intelligence and resilient command and control, and then this catch-all sustainability category, which includes areas ranging from munition stocks to readiness and maintenance and to hardening of facilities. With all of this defense stuff, which area do you foresee the biggest potential challenge in terms of actually implementing one of these areas? And then importantly, where do you see this challenge coming from? Is it resourcing? Is it manpower? Is it technology? Is it political will? What is the challenge, and where do you see the challenge being? What is the cause of that challenge? And so I want to get each of your thoughts on what you see as the biggest challenge to implementation. And if I could, I'll start with Jenny on this one.
I think this is a fascinating question. I don't think I have a particular reaction to, is it going to be easier to invest in one of these areas rather than the others? I would say that the biggest obstacle is resourcing, and is frankly kind of a mindset. And the mindset is, I mean, Ken said something a minute ago about like, well, we can't match China and this sort of thing. I mean, you could, right? Japan's the third richest country in the world. Japan's got a massive GDP, massive population, incredible technological capabilities. So I'm raising this again just because I frequently see discussions like this where it's the same as in Europe, actually, where the debate is couched in terms of, well, given all of our limitations, given that we can't spend more, right? That's kind of the way that lots of these debates go. And I just want to raise the I don't know, kind of be a little provocative and say, this is a choice. And again, it's kind of the classic guns versus butter, as the economists talk about it. And in the United States, you know, we still don't spend historically, you know, our largest amount on defense, right? During wartime, during the Cold War, we spent a lot more, but you know, we spend about in the range of 4% or so of GDP. And that's a choice, because we have foreign policy goals, and we say we need to have a certain amount of military capability to uphold that. And so we have, you know, aging infrastructure and terrible airports and terrible trains, right? So we made that choice. Japan could make that choice too. Again, lots of countries have demographic pressures. Israel has lots of old people, right? Israel has a much smaller GDP, and yet they say we are terrified, and so they spend a lot more on defense. And so Japan, basically, when I look at these numbers, it signals to me that Japan is not yet concluded that it needs to make that kind of a shift, that it needs to give up the butter. And there are probably some really sound reasons for that. And Ken was outlining some principles of the approach of what approach is Japan taking in terms of how it sees its defense, and this idea of more of like a hedgehog strategy and denial and so on. And Japan enjoys a defensive advantage. And so there's all sorts of reasons why you can imagine deterrence will still be pretty secure. So that's how you get to the level that you're at. But again, just I want to remind everyone that that's a choice, and that if Japan were terrified, if it did feel that it had to do more, there's a lot of money on the table, and the question is, do you want to spend it that way?
Ken, the question's over to you. Where do you see the challenges, and what are the challenges?
Among the 7 featured area that you outlined, and I think that counter-strike capability or long-range strike capability is the one I would like to highlight, because in the Asia, we confine ourselves in the exclusively defense-oriented defense. You know, enemies come in and we're gonna respond it. It's a quite an easy scenario for this. But by declaring that we are engaging the adversary not in the vicinity of the Japanese territory, but you know, disrupt and defeat at earlier timing and at the location farther fields, which means that we are also responsible for escalation management. If the invasion is evident, that is okay. But if it's in early stage, we are also responsible for escalating the situation. Are we customized for those kind of practices? No, this is the new dimension that the Japan is now fielding our capability to this, and that will also be quite a concern for Taiwan and also for Korea if Japan properly responds as a force multiplier. But what if the Japan escalate further, much more than what the Taiwan or Koreans may expect to do? And that needs to have a more like a joint responsibility in terms of how we can coordinate our strike capability together. So my preference, personal preference, is that if we try to strike, especially on the far side, we should strike together, so that the kind of jointness and and also we can, so that we can have a like a consequence management mutually, in terms of those activities. So that's number one. And my second concern is that according to our strategy, if the deterrence failed, what we're trying to have is the ensuring of the asymmetrical advantage. And it's been said, sounds like a default, but China is also spending a large amount of scale of money on these new domains as well. Space, cyber, electromagnetic. They have a more license and patents on the AIs, autonomous vehicles and so on. So how can we so sure about those kind of a cross-domain advantage can be materialized in coming 5 to 10 years? Is something that we should not be too naive about it. So I think that this, ensuring the advantage needs to have a robust investment and something like, for example, quantum computing and how you can really materialize as a sensor, radar, and and also those sorts of equipment is essentially important to actually take a constant advantage in the battlefields. And so that those kind of, I think, awareness is something that I wish to explore further, and I want to have more seriousness in the spending more resources and money on these fields.
Well, thank you for that, Ken. I know that to your point, military application of a lot of these technologies is potentially years away, more than just the 5 or 10 years that is outlined in the strategies. And so I think realities will also butt up against some of these implementation areas. Chisako, I want to give you a chance to respond, but I also, I realize my next question builds directly off of something from your presentation. And so I'll ask this question, and you could respond to this one if you want. And it's the second area. You highlighted in your presentation the national security strategy. And that's really, I think, if we look here, there's a national defense strategy, there's the national security strategy. A lot of the discussions are really about the national defense strategy because it focuses a lot on the capabilities. I don't think the national security strategy has received a lot of attention. And it was nice to hear you highlight that in your presentation. In all the focus on Japan's desire to maintain the status quo in the region, we tend to focus on the defense initiatives. Yet the national security strategy, it outlines Japan's diplomatic vision, which includes things like the Quad, FOIP, and a variety of other bilateral and multilateral initiatives. Because you brought this up in your presentation, I want to ask you, where do you see Japan's challenges in implementing its diplomatic vision? And where should it be focusing on its diplomatic endeavors to achieve the type of future that it hopes to achieve?
Thank you for asking this question to me, because I think it's very important because, when we talk about China or Russia, the main question is the new international order. So that's the question we should focus on. So of course, there are many obstacles before we achieve the new one after this, unstable situations in the world. But that's something that needs to be achieved in the end. And when we think about it, I think Japan and many other Western countries should not forget that the world has been represented by the West for too long. And that's the question. Many countries in the global south want to change. So when China tries to appeal those countries, that's something they try to bring up, and that's it has such a magnetic power because many countries are not fully satisfied about it. I don't think it's a very good idea for Japan to emphasize the importance of democracy in each country. Of course, our democracy is so important for us, but the domestic politics, the regimes, it's not something we can, change under the current international rules. So, if we emphasize too much about the importance of, democracy, we might, alienate some, countries that might be able to collaborate with us. And sometimes in some situations, democracy is just too far away for some countries that has just started the national buildings. I think it's, of course, for us, to collaborate, that's an important aspect. But if we look at, further, how to achieve the new international order that can satisfy more people, I think that's not the approach we should pursue. We also emphasize the rule-based order, but rules should be something that everybody respect and follow. For that reason, everybody has to agree to it. So I think for that in mind, I think Japan needs to work more to reestablish its relationship with the developing countries or emerging countries.
Well, we are starting to get questions in, and I would encourage the audience, if you have questions, to again, please post them. Before I turn to the questions from the audience, let me ask one more of my own questions that I'm curious about to hear your thoughts on. And that has to do with domestic politics in Japan and the intersection between domestic politics and the implementation of the strategy. We've already talked about the scope of the ambition of the new documents is impressive. But when I look at the documents, particularly the National Defense Strategy, there are several areas where it would appear to me that domestic legislation is going to be necessary to implement some of the changes. Things like Ministry of Defense authorities over the Coast Guard in a contingency, or privacy laws that would be required to keep pace with a more active cyber defense. And so I'm wondering if somebody, and again, I'll let you raise your hand to who wants to answer this. I'm wondering if someone would like to provide your thoughts on where you anticipate some of the bigger legislative challenges to be, but just as importantly, where you think some of the low-hanging fruit is, and maybe it's not going to be as difficult as we may think. So would any of who would like to tackle that question? Chisako, are you? Yeah.
Okay, so can I go?
Yes.
Obviously, we need to think about how to increase the collaboration between self-defense force and Japan Coast Guard, because Japan Coast Guard is a policing organization, and according to its law, it cannot join the military of not military, the defense function. So well, some people argue that the Japan Coast Guard should keep it because it's a way to manage the situations as it is, because we don't want to have arms race, and for that purpose, Japan Coast Guard should keep its role as a policing organization. But of course, there are more people who are very much worried about the contingencies. So for them, when the current law also allows the Japan Coast Guard to work with under the self-defense force in contingency. So they also want the Coast Guard to carry the defense rules. So that is, well, there are many debates, and I don't think we have had enough debate about it. I'm a little inclined to change the Coast Guard law, but of course there are pros and cons about it. So that's something we expect to have in the coming few years.
Does Jenny or Ken, would you like to provide your thoughts on that?
Sure.
Jenny?
I guess I would say that resourcing and building different military roles, increasing Japan's military roles, and so on in these ways that depart from current norms. This will be domestically challenging in the eyes of the Japanese public and opposition, and even coalition partners, right? And so I think that there isn't yet, there's a growing recognition about China's power and more hawkish approach and so on, but there isn't yet a sense of what is this about, and if we fail to act, what does that mean? And so I think this is really a job for scholars, for policymakers to just kind of lay this out for the Japanese public, and to just get them to understand, like, what are we talking about? This is not just that there's some politician who wishes we had more big ships because they like big ships, right? It's here's what's on the line. So a few years ago, I wrote an essay called "Life in China's Asia," and it was me thinking through, what am I worried about in Asia? And essentially, I looked to previous cases of countries that behaved as what we say in international relations, we call it regional hegemons. So countries that become dominant in their regions, and how do they act and what do they do? I looked at the US in the Western Hemisphere. I looked at the Soviet Union in Europe. I looked at Japan in the early 20th century. And basically, it's, what do? They do things like they get bases in the region. They look for alliances. They try to make sure that they have friendly governments around them. And so what are the ways that they do that? There's a lot of domestic political interference. And this is something that, again, the US history in Latin America is just this massive history of both covert and overt and violent intervention in terms of installing governments who are going to behave in ways that we, Washington, at the time wanted them to behave. And so the methods may be different these days, maybe not arming insurgencies anymore, although we don't know. And so the question is, when you look at China, what are Japan's leaders who are concerned about China? How are they explaining that to the Japanese people? Tell them what you're worried about, right? Tell them, paint this picture and say, like, this is how powerful countries act. And we don't think China's any different. And it might be even worse than some countries that we've seen in the past. So again, I think that's an important element to shaping the political debate over resources and also expanding military roles.
Ken, if you have a thought on that, I'd ask you to be brief, and then I'll turn to the audience questions.
Sure, just 30 seconds. The national security strategy called for pursuing the active cyber defense. And that is a new concept which we don't know the detail, and no kind of detailed implementation plan has been outlined. This definitely needs a new legislation, and they even indicated the current NISC, that is the National Center for Incident Readiness for Cybersecurity, should be reintegrated to the new system. So this is exactly what is happening new, but that will relate to the as you mentioned, national secrecy law, and probably security clearance issues will be there. So the sets of new approaches to implement those new concepts will be definitely needed.
Thank you. Let me turn here, cognizant of the time, to a question. This is from the Vice President of the Mansfield Foundation. And the question has to do with one of the issues that popped up was about personnel challenges, manpower, for implementing some of this. And the question the question is, will Prime Minister Kishida's latest effort to address Japan's low birth rate be too little too late? So we think about the shrinking population, the aging population in Japan. How is that going to affect the manpower to actually, you need sailors to be on ships, you need pilots to be in the air, or, and this is the second part of his question, is can AI come to the rescue? I know a lot of time AI is treated as sort of a fairy dust that we sprinkle on things and think it's going to make things better, but realistically, with the shrinking population in Japan, can AI, there is a lot of talk in the defense strategy about integration of AI with uncrewed systems, and that this will be including combat systems, that this is the future. What are your thoughts? Is Prime Minister Kishida's efforts going to help, or is AI the solution? Thoughts on that?
May I respond? Well, I think that the current level of the personnel sufficiency in the SDF is below that level of the 90-something%. So even though that the budget will be increased, there is no increase of the personnel, and this really signifies what we are now getting at. And so there will be still a hard time for the SDF to recruit the great talents to them, and they need to be getting to the new fields like a cyber and electromagnetic fields, network security, and so on. That is definitely needed. And something that I wish to see is the revolution in the the process innovation of the SDF. We still maintain a very labor-intensive type of the processes in the operation of the SDF. And why do we need expensive, the aircraft, fighter jets, to have a scrambling mission for 900 times a year? And I think it is ridiculous in terms of the imposing cost upon us. And why don't we have more like unmanned kind of standard operation procedures to do this? And let those autonomous AI to have, especially on the ISR missions, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance missions, and then to detect those kind of uncertainties, and then to respond in the real crisis through the more reliable man-made decision, and that should be the drastically adopted in the SDF operation, and there will be lots of more to be explored.
Can I add a little bit?
Yes, please.
Well, decreasing demography is decreasing population or birth rate is a huge problem to Japan, but also to China as well. The number of birth in China dropped to half in last 6 years. So the drop is much even bigger than the case of Japan. But of course, for the people in 20s at this moment, China has huge number, but the number is, demography, population is shrinking in China as well. But in that sense, China, I think China is more prepared for AI or unmanned vehicles. It's been making a lot of researches, and the government is putting so much investment in it. And I think Xi Jinping himself is heading for that part of invention as well. So having that in mind, I think we should work more on that aspect.
Let me direct the next question to Jenny and give you a chance to speak for this next question. And this is from an official from the Philippines, and it is directed to you. Given one of the comments that you said that East Asian countries are not behaving like they're terrified. And what this official is asking is one of the reasons why they are acting that way is because they rely on the United States for their security. And do you think they should increase their spending anyway, despite the fact that they are already relying on the United States?
Thanks for the question. So I think that absolutely that countries that are allies or even partners with the United States are that we talk about different ways that countries can balance against threats. There's internal balancing versus external balancing. And the internal balancing is the amount you might spend and mobilize. And then the external is, do you find allies? And so what we see is a lot of external balancing. Certainly the Philippines has its alliance with the United States. Japan does as well. South Korea does as well. So there's lots of external balancing in that sense. And I mean, that's notable, right? Like after the Cold War, everybody said, well, we don't have threats anymore. And so maybe these alliances aren't necessary anymore. But those countries saw that there were uncertainties in their security environment. I mean, certainly the Korea threat hadn't gone away. And so they said, no, we feel comfortable with this as a means of external balancing. And so I think that is a really important factor. I think that every country has to make decisions about how much it feels, again, back to this guns and butter debate. Every country has demands on its budget. The Philippines does, Japan does, as we're talking about. I mean, China does too. And that's another thing that I'm really glad Chisako-san brought up is that we're talking about a country there that has many limitations and facing pressures on its continued growth and so on. And that's a very important context. So again, the Philippines has its alliance with the United States, and it's not worried about like a high threat situation of, say, a ground invasion, like a Ukraine situation. So there are all sorts of mitigating factors why you might say, well, that explains why they don't spend that much. And it'll just have to be up to the people of the Philippines to decide, do we think this is are we spending enough? Are we comfortable with the US alliance and so on? And just one more point, because this is, again, something you hear very frequently. There's a lot of talk about the credibility of the United States in Asia, and people talk about the Trump years and the worrying statements that he made and so on. But we forget we had 4 years of him, and we still have these robust alliances, and they're quite strong. I don't think the US-Japan alliance has ever been stronger than this. We have very shared sense of purpose. We've got 70 years of working together. So again, that's pretty strong credibility. For the Philippines and for other countries, they obviously have to look at, do we see the US as a reliable ally? In the sense of the US still has a great deal of military power. The US has a strong sense for the region of wanting to have this, I'll bring the Japanese term, the free and open Indo-Pacific. You see a US interest that's continuing. So I think that's all a case for continued American credibility. But another factor in credibility, of course, is power. And as the balance of power changes in the region, I think that's the most important thing for the regional countries to keep their eyes on, is can the United States continue to sort of do the lion's share of the balancing, or do the regional countries need to be contributing more?
The last question, and I'm going to direct this to Ken, and I would ask you to keep your comments to about 2 minutes if you could. This is a question from an assistant manager from FGV Holdings. And the question has to do with the impact on the Quad. Essentially, Japan has put out these security strategies, and how does this impact the grouping, the Quad grouping, in terms of foreign policy, in terms of their activities in the region? Do you see any impact that this is going to have?
Sure. I think Quad has a big potential in forming the alternative coalition in promotion of the standard setting, both on the security and economy. And Quad has been already playing a significant role. But in terms of the security cooperation, obviously there has been certain limits. It's hard to imagine that Indian Navy, have a side-by-side operation with Japan over the certain issues in Northeast Asia. Surreal for SDF to fight together with India on the Kashmir against Pakistan. So we're far from like a mutual defense type of commitments with each other. But it is a kind of standard sharing and, the platform for more robust interoperability among the militaries. And then the recent Quad summit, which was quite a highlight because India took a very unique stance on the Ukraine crisis, given that the historical kind of legacy issues are heavily overshadowing Indian, taking a decisive stance on that issue. But we can try to save the viability of the Quad by focusing on low-hanging fruits type of cooperation, like a supply chain resilience and cooperation on the medicine, labor standards, environment, such things that is try to create the kind of conducive to what we can really collaborate on that scale. And some existing organization like ASEAN has been raising concern that they could be sidelined, but still that the ASEAN remains to be the irreplaceable actor for forging the conference diplomacy and engaging the major powers in the fields. So good thing is that we do have lots of alternatives to promote the different sets of agenda, and that is good for the region.
Thanks, Ken. With that, we are nearing the end of our allotted time, and I do want to thank our three panelists for a very stimulating discussion. We've covered a lot of ground, both regionally as well as domestically, and some technical issues as well. Obviously, there is a lot more to explore on these topics, and it's going to continue to serve as fodder for discussions and op-eds and commentaries and reports in the months and years ahead. Before we all sign off, I would like to personally thank the sponsors of this event, the government of Japan and Nikkei. I would also like to remind all of you who are watching to please fill out the satisfaction survey at the end of our meeting by scrolling down below. And then finally, please join us in about a month's time when there'll be another great panel of experts who will gather to discuss the CPTPP. And for that, stay tuned to Twitter as well as the Asia Undercurrent website for details. With that, all of you who are watching from wherever you are in the world, be well, be safe, and please take care. Thank you very much for joining us.